Hello, class. Today I will be talking to you about Lyndon Johnson and his presidency and also his life. Lyndon Johnson was an American colossus. He was an unexpected president, but certainly not an unprepared one. LBJ, as he liked to be called, had one of the most impressive political resumes of anyone ever to take over the office of president. Born in 1908 in the hill country of Texas, about 60 miles west of Austin on the family farm, Johnson was born into a proud but somewhat impoverished Texas family. LBJ's father was a populist, a several-term Democratic state legislature who struggled in business. Always a forceful, determined personality, young Lyndon did well in school, especially in the extracurricular aspects of school, such as politics and newspaper. And he graduated from high school at 15, and then later attended the Southwestern Texas Teachers College at San Marcos. At college, he edited the school newspaper. Upon graduation, also important about Johnson's early life is to know that because of the family's financial difficulties, his father had gone bankrupt, I think at least twice. LBJ had to work his way through school, and at one point he took 9 months off to teach at an all-Mexican-American school in South Texas, in the little town of Catula, Texas, in order to make money for, I believe it was his final year of undergraduate education. Upon graduation in 1930, Johnson briefly taught high school at a couple of different Texas schools before moving to Washington, D.C. as legislative secretary to Democratic Congressman Richard M. Kleberg. Kleberg had little interest in his day-to-day congressional duties and delegated many of those to Johnson. LBJ began to develop his lifelong network of Washington contacts at this time, cultivating congressmen, newspapermen, lobbyists, and becoming friends with aides to President Roosevelt, FDR, and fellow Texans, and the staff, becoming friends with aides to FDR, not FDR himself yet, although that would happen later, and also aides to fellow Texans, Vice President John Nance Garner and House Speaker Sam Rayburn. Johnson was elected Speaker of the Little Congress by his peers, congressional aides. In 1935, Johnson headed back to Texas to run the Texas National Youth Administration, a New Deal program that provided education and job opportunities for young people. In April of 1937, Johnson, now 28, won a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives, representing a district that covered Austin and the Hill Country. And he ran on a pro-New Deal platform. At this point in his career, Johnson was a strong liberal and a strong supporter of FDR's New Deal. Tremendously driven and ambitious, LBJ worked extremely long hours, poring over the details of his work and answering every constituent letter personally. LBJ always expected the same level of dedication from his staff, insisting that staffers work exceedingly long hours and be available to take his phone calls at any time, day or night. In 1941, Johnson ran in a special election for the Democratic nomination for a U.S. Senate seat from Texas, very narrowly losing to Texas Governor Pappy O'Daniel. Also, as a congressman, Johnson cultivated President Roosevelt and became close to him. FDR enjoyed the young Texan and relied upon him for information about Texas politics, and particularly about fellow Texas politicians John Nance Garner, and Sam Rayburn. While a sitting congressman, Johnson also served as a naval officer during World War II, briefly seeing active duty in the South Pacific. In 1948, Johnson finally realized his ambition to become a U.S. Senator, winning the Democratic nomination, which at that time was tantamount to election, by a mere 87 votes, and under somewhat dubious circumstances. There was a lot of talk of ballot box stuffing and the like. But he won the Democratic nomination nonetheless over former Governor Coke Stevenson, and then won in the general election in November of 48. He was dubbed ironically dubbed Landslide Lyndon after this victory. As soon as he arrived in Washington, true to form, Johnson began assiduously courting the older and extremely powerful Georgia Democrat Richard Russell, who was the undisputed leader of the Senate's Southern coalition and, many believed, the most powerful man in the U.S. Senate. In successfully becoming Russell's protege, Johnson mirrored tactics he'd employed earlier on House Speaker Sam Rayburn. Both Rayburn and Russell came to see LBJ as like a son, which of course was not at all bad for Johnson's career. LBJ rose fast in the Senate, becoming minority leader in 1953 and majority leader in 1955 at the very young age of 46. LBJ became almost certainly the most powerful majority leader in Senate history during his tenure as majority leader from 1955 through 61. The keys to his power were his deep and intimate knowledge of virtually every senator's tendencies, both personal and political, and how they were likely to vote on every important bill, along with his great skill at persuading senators to vote as he wished them to. He used something that became known as the Johnson treatment. Johnson was very tall, over 6'3", and he would lean in close to other senators and other people that he wanted to persuade to do his bidding. He'd lean in very, very close and cajole them, basically intimidate them, do whatever it took to persuade them physically, personally, to do his bidding. LBJ deserves the lion's share of the credit for passage of the 1957 Civil Rights Act, which, although it was not nearly as meaningful as the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which LBJ also secured passage of as president, was the first significant piece of civil rights legislation enacted since the 1870s. LBJ very much wanted to become president in 1960, and he thought he could swoop in late in the Democratic primaries, or really at the Democratic convention, and capture the party's nomination as the consensus candidate after the other major candidates, John F. Kennedy, Senator Hubert Humphrey, and Senator Stuart Symington of Missouri, had all damaged one another in the primaries. The strategy failed, however. Johnson launched a campaign in July and then led a Stop Kennedy effort at the Democratic convention. But the efforts failed as John F. Kennedy won the nomination on the first ballot. Kennedy then asked Johnson to be his running mate, over the strong objections, I might add, of powerful labor union leaders and party liberals who viewed Johnson as far too conservative on questions concerning organized labor and civil rights. Johnson accepted Kennedy's offer. Why did Kennedy offer Johnson the number 2 slot on the ticket? Well, he felt he needed the Texas senator to help him win key southern states, such as Texas. And the move worked out. Johnson campaigned hard and effectively for the ticket, and Texas and Kennedy and Johnson won Texas in November, along with a number of other southern states. As vice president, Johnson was perhaps as dissatisfied as at any point in his long political career. Johnson often felt scorned and marginalized as vice president by JFK and his elite, Ivy League-educated circle of top advisors. Instead of employing Johnson's unmatched legislative knowledge and skill to assist with the passage of legislation, Kennedy kept Johnson busy with a seemingly endless stream of ceremonial functions, many of them outside of the country. LBJ was traveling with JFK on the fateful day in Dallas when the young president was assassinated. And Johnson was sworn in as the nation's 36th president on Air Force One before it left Dallas for Washington, shortly following Kennedy's assassination. As the president, under such sudden and tragic circumstances, Johnson was determined to calm a troubled nation and to fulfill his fallen predecessor's legacy. In his speech to the nation on November 27th, 5 days after Kennedy's death, Johnson, recalling Kennedy's inaugural 3 years earlier, in which the young leader had intoned, "Let us begin," Johnson said to the nation, "Let us continue." A deeply engaged president, LBJ set about immediately to enact the major legislation Johnson had supported, most notably a major tax cut and the Civil Rights Bill that Kennedy had proposed in 1963. Working closely with congressional leaders such as Virginia's Harry Byrd, LBJ first secured passage of the tax cut bill, and then turned to the much more difficult civil rights legislation. Knowing that the Southern Coalition, led by his former mentor, Russell, would strongly oppose the Civil Rights Bill, LBJ understood that his only chance to pass the bill would be to persuade significant numbers of Republicans to support the legislation. To do this, he'd need the backing of Minority Leader Everett Dirksen, a Republican of Illinois. Both LBJ and his floor manager of the bill, Senator Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota, worked day and night on Dirksen and eventually won his support. This came, however, after a more than 54-day filibuster led by the Southern Coalition of the legislation. With Dirksen's backing, however, the bill passed by a vote of 71 to 29, defeating, in effect, the Southern Coalition's filibuster of the bill and ending that filibuster. The key vote here was a vote to end debate, a cloture vote. And it was the second successful cloture vote in the Senate since 1927. The bill passed the Senate. It had already passed the House, and then it passed the Senate in March of '64 by a vote of 71 to 29. It had been a long fight, but it was very worthwhile. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 represented a stronger version of Kennedy's proposed legislation, and it banned discrimination in public accommodations, such as places such as hotels, restaurants, and theaters. And it also banned discrimination in education and employment, and granted broad enforcement powers to the federal government. the most significant piece of civil rights legislation in American history, except perhaps for the 13th Amendment of 1865, which banned slavery. The act essentially spelled the death knell for the old Jim Crow system in the South. LBJ worked closely not only with Humphrey, Dirksen, and other members of Congress, but also with key leaders in the civil rights community in crafting and eventually passing the legislation. Leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr. In 1965, Johnson followed up the Civil Rights Act of 64 with an act to secure voting rights for Southern blacks. In large numbers of Southern counties, significant majorities of blacks were still deprived of the right to vote, to register to vote, and to vote. And using tactics similar to those that he'd employed to gain passage of the 64 Civil Rights Act, in July of 65, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 passed the Senate, having already passed in the House. Civil rights was but one part of LBJ's vision of the Great Society that he hoped to secure in the United States. Other aspects of this so-called Great Society included ending poverty, promoting a clean environment, healthcare reform, urban renewal, and educational reform. Johnson wanted to outdo his political hero, FDR, in terms of the passage of important domestic legislation. The Great Society, in Johnson's view, would be the logical continuation of FDR's New Deal. And Johnson went into overdrive in 1964 and 1965 to achieve his lofty domestic goals. In pursuit of his so-called war on poverty, Johnson received passage in 1964 of the Economic Opportunity Act, which created the Job Corps, VISTA, Volunteers in Service to America, which was the domestic equivalent of the Peace Corps, and the Community Act, which provided efforts to combat urban poverty. I'm sorry, the Community Act program. The Economic Opportunity Act set in motion legislations creating programs such as, that are still with us today, programs such as Head Start, food stamps, and work study. In 65, LBJ secured passage of bills creating the Medicare and Medicaid systems of medical insurance. In 1964, with Johnson's backing, the Wilderness Act was passed, and the act guaranteed the continued presence of large tracts of roadless wilderness in the nation's forest reserves. Johnson and his legislative allies achieved a major overhaul of the nation's immigration laws with the passage of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. The act removed all national origins quotas dating from the 1920s and earlier, and basically became the template for our modern immigration regime. The Higher Education Act of 1965 focused on funding for lower-income students and included loans, grants, and money for work study. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965 provided significantly higher levels of funding for public schools, and particularly for public schools in poor areas of the country, as an aspect of Johnson's effort to provide more opportunity to poor youth in the country. Also in 1965, Johnson established the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for Humanities to support academic subjects such as literature, history, and law, and art such as music, painting, and sculpture. In his rush to strike while the iron was hot and outdo the New Deal, Johnson and the overwhelmingly Democratic Congress of 1964 and 65 passed a massive amount of domestic legislation, some of it highly significant. This was really a high watermark for post-war liberalism. And it was hopeful, and this liberalism was hopeful and optimistic at its core. The fact that not all of the legislation enacted in this period was considered as deliberately as it might have been did not overly concern Johnson or his chief advisors at the time.